So
I think if we can, we might make a start in about 10 seconds. Given the lateness of the time, I don't intend to go into any length at all in introductions. I think the secret is to get people speaking as quickly as we can. What I will try and do is keep everyone fairly strictly to 20 minutes, and I think it might be best if we run through the three speakers if they're agreeable, and confine our question time to the end, and then we'll run through and hopefully have about 15 or 20 minutes of question time left. So with that very short foray, can I introduce Dr. Michael Ball from the Department of Economics, Birkbeck College.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? It's better if I stand up. All right. What I wanted to talk about today was the property boom that happened in various countries at various stages in the second half of the 1980s. And then, of course, the interesting thing is not just about the boom itself, but what have been the consequences of the boom, and what are the likely consequences for city structures and the way in which cities function. Now, the general topic is so broad, I obviously can't cover everything, but I just wanted to emphasise a few points as sort of a way of stimulating discussion. The first thing to notice about the property boom and its aftermath, if you look at all the papers, there's this sort of dazed feeling. How did it all happen? Is the basic sense you get. And there's this sort of idea that bankers and property developers had found this new wonder drug, which gave them tremendous euphoria, and everybody just dived in. And the classic case of that, of course, is Canary Wharf development, which was talked about this morning, in the sense that there was an empty piece of land which nobody thought was going to be anything but a few warehouses at one stage. And then Mrs. Thatcher waved her magic wand, and then came these big property developers, and up went Canary Wharf. And then at the end of the day, the bankers said, we didn't know they owed us so much money. Which I found a very remarkable thing. So that's sort of one idea of this. So that type of description also gets taken as an explanation for what happened. And to a certain extent it's true. There's no way that one can argue that what happened was, quote, something rational, and it was the market being via the invisible hand, being the best planner in the world. It's quite clearly things went wrong. But the important question, I think, is what went wrong, what was going on, and what is still going on, because it wasn't just something that happened which will never happen again. Now, the explanation that comes out of that is twofold. One, it was primary financial liberalisation which caused the enormous boom in property markets, and the property markets of particular concern are private housing and commercial development, that's offices and shops and so on. And financial liberalisation caused it, and it linked then with these fairly bizarre expectations about what would happen in the world to lead to this property boom we had. Now that sort of explanation, as I said, has some grain of truth, but it's a little strange. In the 1970s, I remember, there used to be these tremendous debates between Keynesian and some monetarists about how the world was affected, and to a certain extent the monetarists won the general political debate at the end of the 70s. But since then, and everybody talks about it now, everybody's gone back to sort of being Keynesian related. They don't particularly like just the idea of money being the driving force within economies. And I accept that view entirely. But when we look at property markets, somehow it's the availability of credit which determines how much is provided and the price at which it's provided. And that, to me, doesn't seem a strong enough form of analysis. So it's just monetarism plus madness, if you like, explains the property boom, and we're all living with the consequences now. But if we actually look at what was going on within cities and take a much longer-term view of the role that urban areas have had in advanced societies, I think we can get a slightly different picture of what went on. We still have this credit and bizarre expectations component, and I won't dwell on that too much now, but there are certain other systematic factors, I think, that were going on at the time and are still going on, which are of greatest importance. Now, already discussed in the conference, and everybody's aware of it, is the fact that modern industrial societies, in virtually all cases, have had a very strong increase in their service sectors in relationship to their manufacturing sectors. It sometimes gets dubbed as deindustrialisation, the post-industrial society. Whatever you want to call it, there's been this enormous switch towards services. Now, just reeling out a couple of statistics. For example, Britain, where this phenomenon happened very, very rapidly during the 1980s, it had been obviously developing before. In, I think, 79, about 6% of gross domestic product came from financial services. By the end of the 80s, it was 13%. Okay, a huge, great shift in the structure of an economy. Those sorts of changes you only see fairly rarely in the composition of the way in which economies operate. But Britain, to a certain extent, in the financial services sector, was an exception, but all those sorts of changes, not just financial services, but other services, were growing very, very rapidly. And within the service sectors, there were two sorts of new jobs being created: very low-paid jobs in some service sectors and some functions within particular industries, but at the same time, very high-paid jobs, lots of professionals being drawn in at very high salaries. So that was the pattern of development that was going on. Now, this sort of development within an economy is obviously going to be influence the function that most major cities have. And so, again, taking London as example, but we could look at Sydney or any other major city in the world, you get the decline of the industrial base, if it was ever there, but usually it was quite substantially there. London was once Britain's biggest manufacturing base, and you get the switch towards services and service-type employment. Now, that obviously changes the functions and the way in which a city will operate. Now, if you look at property markets, one of the things that comes out very, very noticeably is from the mid-70s through, it varies from country to country, but the States and the UK are very, very good examples of this. From the mid-70s through to the mid-80s or the late 80s, office development seemed immune to the cycle. There was an enormous recession in the early 80s, but office development had a little blip and carried on growing afterwards. So there was a long-term growth of office development that occurred within the process. And similarly, at the same time, there were lots of other factors going on within particular areas which encouraged particular forms of service sector growth. I mean, the classic one, of course, being financial liberalisation of the time. Now, all this stuff obviously is going to increase the demand for offices and will have very considerable knock-on effects on housing markets. And within the housing markets, there were considerable shifts as well towards middle and upper income groups. A lot of that, again, associated with the growth of professional services within the service sector industries. But what happened, I think, was that developers and bankers, to a certain extent, saw these trends, saw these shifts, and assumed that they were riding a trend. There would be fluctuations within the growth pattern, but essentially what they'd been seeing for the previous 10 years would carry on. And again, to go back to Olympia in York, one of the Reichman brothers said, we're not building for this cycle, we're building for the long term across cycles. So there's some perspective that the sorts of things they were building would be required in the future. If you overbuild for a few years, give the bankers a bad time, but in the end you'll come out of it okay. But what happened, I think, is that people actually got it wrong in terms of the way in which the service sector revolution and the way in which it operates within cities and not just cities, out of town developments and so on as well, they got it wrong. Now, what was happening within services? Well, to a certain extent, it was a demand shift and just a reflection of technical changes within manufacturing. But at the same time, there were considerable technical developments going on which were encouraging lots of service sector activities. The classic thing, of course, being the introduction of computers and computerization. Now, what we had there was a major innovation cycle, I would suggest, and not the first one that's occurred. In fact, these things occur on a fairly regular basis, and you can sort of recognise the changes, shifts in types of transport and so on. But what we had there was a major technical revolution which had certain implications as it was introduced. And to start with, those implications were it made a lot of service activities more profitable, it opened the scope for what particular firms could do, and it was very labour demanding. In other words, the equipment was planted in, if you like, to pre-existing types of activity and didn't actually change the organisation of the way in which that activity took place to start with. So the upward increase in demand for those services would imply a very substantial increase in employment within the sector as well. As the innovation cycle carried on, what is probably happened was, first of all, everybody dives in, so you get initial excess capacity in particular areas. The classic, again, being the financial services sectors in New York and London for this, but you could read this for many other countries, many other types of activity as well. And then, so you get a growth of excess capacity of people coming in, but then at the same time, what all those firms were doing was actually going to be substantially restructured by the way in which the technology was developing and the way in which there was a considerable shakeout in the organisation of those service sector activities. So a lot of people have dubbed, particularly in the US, the latest recession as being the shakeout in services that, to an extent, manufacturing had seen in previous recessions, and a very, very big change in what's going on. Now, what does this mean? Well, what it means is that a lot of the offices that were being built in the 80s were being built for a particular type of organisation of service production that occurred as the innovations were taking place. Within that framework, we can see one classic case, which is, and again Canary Wharf exemplifies it most strongly, which is a form of giantism, that you've got to have, you can get economies of scale in services. The new technologies give you economies of scale. Lots of financial institutions talked about the economies of scale and scope they could get by providing lots of different activities. But that was similarly true for administrative functions. And Canary Wharf and the likes of Canary Wharf are an outcome of this. Very, very big offices that somehow every institution want to group all its activities into. Now, there are obviously institutions around that wish to do that, but there aren't enough. And the numbers of people they're employing and the type of activities in which they're operating have been relatively shrinking compared to the other types of employment structure. So the implication of this is a lot of the large property developments of the 80s are now, to a certain extent, redundant. It's not simply building ahead of time, but building in areas and types of structures which will not be required in anything like the extent to which people believed they were. Now that's true for office development, and you could carry on through into particular other types of activity, the growth of shops and so on, and just not simply say people overbuilt, but they were building for a particular time and misforecasting the way in which future trends would take place. Now, the reason why these misforecasts were so worrying or so disastrous in terms of what went on was, first of all, that developers could easily convince financiers that these forecasts were right, and they had lots of professional forecasting bodies around telling them similar types of thing, and that was quite clearly wrong because people were not looking ahead in terms of what was going on. But secondly, it's the very nature of property markets and the way in which they work, because property markets have very long times between the implementation of a project and the finish of a project. Now, there was a big change in the 80s in terms of that, which again occurred around the world, which that lead time, the long lag between having the idea and getting it realised and getting the building up, shortened quite considerably through developments in construction technology, including the staple on wallpaper, all those sorts of things. You can do things much, much quicker and build much, much faster. So completion times on construction projects became much, much shorter. Now that again encouraged firms, because the lag was shortening, to produce more, to get in there to a certain extent before the boom and bust, and there was credit in order to do it. And the long lags, though, mean that once the investment gets going, it's quite it invariably happens that a lot of people who are producing dwelling offices will be frustrated in terms of achieving what they wanted. In other words, the boom's going to bust. But in the case of the 80s boom, it just went on. It was just went out of scale because of the nature of the financial liberalisation. Now, what implications have happened in a broad sense? I'm constrained too much in time to talk about housing markets, but to a certain extent, changes in housing markets were a product of contemporary circumstances, but also a knock-on effect from the services type revolution, and the depression in housing markets is a similar knock-on effect down. Now, one of the problems that took place within this context, and the reason why, of course, the developments have taken the form that they have, was that there was an abandonment very much of the interrelationship between government and private developers in what broadly gets termed planning. Now, it wasn't an abandonment in the sense that government stopped doing anything, but the idea of there having to be a fairly close link between the forms of infrastructural development within urban areas and property development broke down. Somehow it would be there. The market would somehow bring these things in, which was rather bizarre, given that the main form of infrastructure is obviously going to be provided on a non-market basis. So again, we can see this throughout the industrialised world. And it's had a very important effect on the US election. They keep on going infrastructure, 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 and you clock up votes as you do so. And this is true across many, many particular countries. But what the planning thing also meant was that many urban areas now have very unbalanced built environments, built structures in relationship to the potential activities that are going on within cities. There's an enormous excess of offices, and I would suggest of offices that aren't of a particularly useful form for the next decade or so. But the problem with that enormous excess of offices is they don't just go away. It's very expensive to refunction and restructure things once they are created. So the existence of those offices then has a subsequent knock-on effect on what's going to happen within urban life. Now, there are two trends that are particularly worrying at the moment within that context. It's not just simply the major imbalance, far too much office space and shopping space relative to other activities, but also that it's quite likely that governments will now be forced to try and bail these things out. Again, London's the classic case of should they spend an awful lot of money on a tube line whose only function is to try and bail out a lot of property developers down in the East End of London. That fundamentally affects, and so we've got subsequent knock-on effects of the way in which the infrastructure of a city goes, and so to a certain extent the mistakes of the 80s might get reproduced in the mistakes of the 90s in trying to bail them out, rather than thinking about what type of urban structure and what type of activities will take place in the future. Now, there's a couple of other worries. The debt overhang, of course, is enormous. The recessions around the world at the moment have been very much caused by the property boom and its aftermath. Nobody really talked about it during the US general election, apart from being rude about George Bush. But if you remember, when George Bush got into power, there was this enormous savings and loans crisis. 500 trillion, billion, whichever the number is. It's an extremely large number anyway. It cost the federal government to bail out. It's bigger than the debt of Mexico and Brazil and all these sorts of comparative statistics. And that crisis and the credit crunch it caused within the financial system was very influential in pushing the US into recession. So to a certain extent, the property boom has even changed the nature of politics in terms of the way it moves on. But this is a problem also, as I said, within the future development of cities. Now, I just want to finish by being mildly utopian, which is a trait which was heavily criticised yesterday evening, in terms of what should happen, what should we do about this. Well, to a certain extent, there are worrying trends. They're there, they exist, and there's nothing really that can be done about the past. The past has happened. They are, in the title of my paper, sunk costs. Those sunk costs will have effect and they might actually sink cities, who knows. But what one could argue, I think, is that we need to get back in terms of policies, and I do actually think policies have some effect, in terms of thinking of the way in which cities should function. Should it just be that the public sector now tries to deal with the aftermath of what happened in the 80s? Or should there be more serious thinking about what the likely future roles of urban areas are? Because one of the trends which probably happen as a result of the 80s property boom is that suburbanisation, or the flight from cities, will be increased because they have now highly imbalanced urban environments and people won't like living in them, the jobs won't be there in quite the same way, so that will actually force people out. Now, on the other hand, governments could start investing, and to a certain extent they are in certain areas, in what might be the new form of the city, or the way in which cities are changing. And the thing I would emphasise there is that the advantages of urban areas, which is the sort of classic ones that everybody talk about, is that they're agglomeration, you get the benefits of centrality. Now, within a service sector-oriented society, that what's probably going to happen to urban areas in the future is that there'll be a lot less major administrative blocks sitting in the middle of them, a much more fragmented form of employment. If the revolution in the service sector has anything, has any similarities to what went on within manufacturing, things will break down. There'll be lots of more interlinking between semi-autonomous units. Now, at the same time, you can create activities within urban areas which everybody likes, the benefits of urban life, rather than just simply being a place where you live and work. It's actually a place where you can get considerable benefits from. So I would actually argue that what should be done in terms of government attitude towards the infrastructure of cities and the planning within cities is actually to provide a lot more facilities which create interaction at the personal level, the things that people enjoy. It's the very development for the service sector, and at one level people would argue that it's the types of activities that are being demanded, and that actually the public sector should respond to that in terms of the way in which urban forms operate. So the idea of a city and the way in which it operates should emphasise much more public facilities, much public in the sense of places where people go, not necessarily public owned, and the interaction and freeing up of transport systems and so on. But that, as I say, to a certain extent means ignoring what happened in the property booms of the past. I'd just like to finish on one thing, though, that I've made the property boom seem very much a gloom and doom thing in terms of its effect on urban areas, and that is undoubtedly true. But there are always a few silver linings behind clouds. And one thing that's particularly interesting, I think, at the moment is that London just about priced itself out of the world markets as a long-term financial centre about 8 years ago. And New York was very much going the same way. It was one of the reasons why people built so many offices. They thought it was literally streets paved with gold. But now there's an enormous oversupply of offices. Prices have gone down considerably. Now that presumably is true all around the world. In Tokyo they were talking about the throwaway building. You have it up for a couple of years, chuck it away. And the reason is that the land values in relationship to the price of the building is so small. Well, that ratio has now gone considerably the other way as land values in Japan have plummeted. And so the notions of throwaway buildings in some sense aren't the same. But again, there's been that increase in supply has had a major impact on the viability, on viability of certain activities within Tokyo. You could go around, as I say, the world cities saying that. So to a certain extent, there are some silver linings, and there will be knock-on effects of that. But overall, what we've got in terms of a built environment now has been severely distorted, and I think it's one of the major concerns that we must face now. Of course, distortion means you have choices, you imply you want to be somewhere else, and that's the thing that policy should address. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much. I think unless there are some highly specific sort of technical questions that we can roll on and save questions to the end, that's preferable. That's so. Could I introduce Professor John Parr?
wonder if the points can be handed out. Something down that way, so I can just do it for this side. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been entertained, and I use the word in its most general sense, and exposed also to a variety of technical and philosophical approaches, and it's ended up with a diversity which has been for me anyway, rather terrifying. Well, I have bad news for you, because I really want to add to this diversity, but by looking at another perspective. One, I hope, which touches on and is complementary to some of the others. My major concern, and what I want to talk about in the time available to me, is the changing nature of the metropolitan area. By metropolitan area, I'm referring here to the large city. And I want to confine my attention to the nations of Western Europe and North America. But perhaps it will be better to generalize it even further to the countries of the so-called developed world. The other thing that I want to emphasize is the fact that the notion of the metropolitan area may have outlived its usefulness as an appropriate perspective or as a scale of analysis. In fact, I shall be arguing that the metropolitan area has been superseded, or is coming to be superseded, by a much broader, territorially more extensive entity. We know very well that the metropolitan area has, for the last 150 years or so, it represented a focus of economic activity. It's also been a centre of social and political change, as well as creative and intellectual endeavour. More recently, certainly the last 20 years or so, what we've been seeing in the metropolitan area, what has been thrown into very strong relief, is the metropolitan area as a focus of economic and social stress. One example, and I'll only mention one, is deindustrialization, the incidence of which has impacted on the metropolitan area to a much greater extent than in the nation as a whole. Now, this partly reflects, obviously, previous specializations which the metropolitan area had. Now, along with deindustrialization, one of the other dramatic aspects, and I really think it is dramatic, is population decline in metropolitan areas. Now, I'm not talking about the decline of the central city or the inner part of a metropolitan area. I'm talking about the decline of the whole built-up area. Now, that doesn't mean to say that all parts of this metropolitan area are declining, but as an entity, as a totality, the population, for example, of Greater London is decreasing, and has been so since 1939. The population of Greater Glasgow, the Clydeside conurbation, is decreasing. And if we'd been having a similar gathering in 1950, or even as late as 1960, and somebody had suggested that the populations of major metropolitan areas in Western Europe and North America would be undergoing a decline, a significant and even substantial decline, by the end of the 20th century, the person wouldn't have been laughed at. A gathering such as this would be far too civilized to laugh at a person, but it would have had an unconvincing ring about it. Now, let me put up, if I may, the first. It's in your handout on the first page. Yes, and here you can see for selected metropolitan areas for a number of countries, population declining, and these declines are on an average annual basis, and they all refer to a metropolitan area. What used to be the SMSA in the United States, what was roughly used to be called in the British census the conurbation, a term that's no longer used in the census. Within the UK, and I've only shown some of them, virtually all metropolitan areas, say those 500,000 up, have experienced a decline within the last 10 years. In the US, the decline has been more on a sectional basis. So these refer to cities of the Atlantic seaboard, the Middle Atlantic states, and the Midwest. In Australia, the case is a little bit different, and I don't want to sort of make too much of this point. The metropolitan areas are still increasing in population, although at a decreasing rate, and also at a rate which is often lower than other parts of the respective states. This may have something to do with the federal structure, the existence and the policy of maintaining capital cities. A further point that I wish to raise is that the tendency exists among urban analysts to treat the city, the metropolitan area, as an entity in its own right. This is legitimate enough. The city, or the major metropolitan area, has its own economy, it has its own labour market, its own housing and land market, it has its own set of problems and its own set of policies. So to some extent it is perfectly reasonable to regard the city, the larger metropolitan area, in this way. But in doing so, we run a great danger of only describing half of an object that we're interested in describing. As late as the 1940s in North America, and probably even later in Western Europe, it would have been possible to draw a boundary around the metropolitan area, say roughly just beyond the built-up area, using some density criterion. And this boundary would have encompassed the bulk of the interactions that took place in a metropolitan area. It would cover the bulk of the interaction in the housing market, the journey to work patterns of service provision. Nowadays, the boundary still exists, but its significance, I would submit, is changed considerably. The boundary is ignored. So many of the processes, economic processes, ignore the boundary. Commuting, substantial commuting over the boundary occurs. Recreation patterns now are not confined to the metropolitan area. People are no longer limited to a municipal park or local entertainment centre, but would range quite freely, such as the level of modern mobility throughout an area well beyond the city or the metropolis. Also, in terms of service provision, the reach of the metropolitan area is considerably larger, so that in terms of shopping patterns, again, the boundary is being transgressed. But more generally, there seems to be a disengagement from the metropolitan area, and of course this disengagement is now of such a nature as to cross the boundary. It used to be that when firms or households decided that they wanted to improve their position within a metropolitan area, then it would simply be a movement within, typically to the edge of a metropolitan area. In other words, the disengagement process took place within the boundary. Nowadays, the disengagement process, whether it is by households or firms, certainly takes place beyond that boundary. Accompanying the metropolitan decline, we also find growth of population and employment in an area well beyond, not just the immediate periphery of the metropolitan area, but a much broader region, sometimes extending, say, a radius of 100 kilometers or more in North America, from the metropolitan area. If we take the case of London, there are many examples we could use, but I guess most of you will be more familiar with London than elsewhere. So let's just take the GLC over the period 1971 to 1981. Over that period, the residential population declined, rounding it off, by approximately 10%. That's a 10% decline. It would have amounted to something like 750,000 population. This is not a trivial change. This is a significant change. More importantly, and perhaps more interestingly, in the rest of the so-called metropolitan region, the metropolitan region extending out to about 75 kilometers, 40 miles, the rest of the metropolitan region, outside the GLC area, that rose by 4.5% over the same period. And if we take the outer, another annular ring beyond that, let's call it the rest of the southeast, then we find that that growth rate was, again over the period 71-81, 7.5%. Now these two outer regions, it's not because they have a small base and therefore the percentage population is large. These two outer regions comprise collectively a population greater than the population of the GLC. So that these figures I'm giving you are not just simply dramatic statistics based on rates. They are also could be translated into absolute numbers. Well, we have two trends then. The metropolitan area, particularly the larger metropolitan area, declining in population, an area beyond it which is experiencing growth of population and growth of employment. Clearly, the two are linked, although not in a straightforward way. And this brings me, I suppose, to the main point that the metropolitan area as an entity is failing to capture too many of the relevant interactions that affect it. By the same token that, say, 50 years ago, sociologists and then other urban analysts had come to realize that we couldn't look at the central city or the political city, the de jure city, to describe the whole metropolitan area. That was inadequate, and that came to be recognized. So we used other concepts such as the conurbation, the metropolitan area. In the US Census, the SMSA, in Canada, Canadian Census, the CMA. But my argument here is that by the same token that that we recognized that weakness and we needed a proper measuring rod for the metropolitan area, now I'm saying that the metropolitan area itself is not an adequate scale for examining the metropolitan area. In other words, to understand the metropolitan area, we have to look over a much broader area. And I would argue that the metropolitan area is coming to be replaced by a larger, territorially more extensive entity, which I'm going to refer to as the Metropolitan Area Based Region, the MBR. Now, in the handout you have in front of you, what I've sketched out, and it's only a diagrammatic sketch, it has no significance other than beyond the diagrammatic generalization. It looks, this would be the boundary of the metropolitan area-based region, and the metropolitan area-based region consists of two broad parts. A metropolitan zone, in the case of London, Manchester, sometimes quite territorially extensive. And also, well, let's just concentrate for a moment on the metropolitan zone. The metropolitan zone is, of course, the metropolitan area. And that is obvious, and Michael has just described it, other people have alluded to it, a range of economic functions. In terms of the spatial structure of these functions, it's worth mentioning that it is a center, the metropolitan area or the metropolitan zone of this region is a center of decision-making, administration, control, innovation, information processing. It's also a center for the production of goods and services, many of which are supplied to the non-urban zone which surrounds it, as well as to other markets, be they rest of the UK markets or rest of the world markets. Certainly true in the case of financial services. The second component, the second zone, is what I'm calling the non-metropolitan zone, again of some considerable territorial extent. I'm reluctant to put a number on it. It would be at least for the UK our average of 100k, and probably twice that amount in the typical metropolitan region, metropolitan area-based region of the US. The non-metropolitan zone contains a rural population as well as a substantial urban population. The urban population, I've just shown it diagrammatically. Of course, rural-urban is a little bit difficult to, it's not a particularly meaningful distinction over the inner part here, but the urban area is generally, urban areas or the urban population is generally larger than the rural population, and the urban population is organized typically on a hierarchical basis. The goods and services are produced here are often exported to the metropolitan area, though not exclusively. Likewise, the non-metropolitan area imports a large amount of goods and services from the metropolitan zone itself. After all, the metropolitan zone, the metropolitan area, is the ultimate service centre, central place for this region. That's how the region is being defined. I don't want to give you the impression, and perhaps this diagram does, that although there is a considerable complementarity between the two zones of the region is not a closed entity. So there's plenty, it's open. This metropolitan zone trades with the rest of the world, as does the non-metropolitan zone. Dividing up the national economic space in that way, we would probably end up with 50 to 60 such regions in the US, maybe somewhere between 10 and 15 in the UK, France, Germany and Italy, smaller number in the countries of Scandinavia and the Low Countries, and maybe 5 or 6 in Australia, 2 or 3, probably 3 in New Zealand. I don't really want to claim any originality with this concept. It was used, or a very similar concept, the city region was used by Dickinson over 40 years ago, and also over 40 years ago the American sociologist Donald Bogue coined the term metropolitan community. The point I want to emphasize is that the metropolitan area-based region, it seems to me, is coming now to dominate the spatial organization of the economy and probably the spatial organization of society in a way that it hadn't when the earlier writers were suggesting it. Now, very briefly, because I want to look at some of the trends, I want to look at the internal organization, or what we might call the spatial structure of this metropolitan area-based region. So if you can turn over on your handout, I'll put up another diagram. There's a variety of ways, cartographic, diagrammatic, of describing the spatial structure of a region, and what I'm going to use is one that's used quite heavily in urban economic analysis, and that is the density function. What the density function does, it simply relates the density, that's to say population per square kilometre or per hectare, per square mile, to the distance from the centre. So we take a distance, say 15 kilometres from the centre, and we average all the distances out in an annular ring, and we end up with a particular point. So at a distance there is an average density, and that's what this is. You'll see that very near the centre it falls away. That's because of land being used for non-residential purposes. A peak is reached. In London's case it will be 3.5 kilometres from Oxford Circus. Both diagrams are scaled, the vertical scale is logarithmic. Partly that's just for purposes of description, but more importantly, the fact that over this range the function appears to be fairly linear is indication of the negative exponential function, for which a great deal of empirical evidence exists. That is to say that over this range from the crest to the edge of the metropolitan area, and I'm sorry I should have mentioned that X prime stands for the edge of the metropolitan area and R stands for the boundary or edge of the region. From the crest to the boundary, the logarithm of density falls with distance at an approximately constant rate. On this diagram, both axes are scaled in logarithms, and this enables us to see again another regularity which has been observed, the linearity over this range. Now, of course, this linearity means that the logarithm of density declines with the logarithm of distance at a constant rate. One of the reasons I'm using a diagram of that type is that it does and has represented a very good description of the spatial structure of the economy. I've used population, we could use employment, we could use workforce, and we could make a number of comparisons between them. But pressing ahead, let me use that approach, and in a sense I had to introduce it for what I wanted to say, to indicate how the position is changing within London, within most or many metropolitan areas and metropolitan area-based regions. What you're seeing here is two curves, one for 1950 and one for 1990. It's this curve for two different years. Now, because we're scaling this in logarithms, it means that this distance, the vertical separation between the two curves, is proportional to the growth rates. So we can actually read off the growth rates on this. And three things very quickly. We see inner city decline. It's not just decline of population density. I mean, sure, population density is declining, but since the area is remaining, the land area is remaining exactly the same, that means population must be declining. So we can talk about population rather than population density. Over the outer part of the metropolitan area, recall that X prime refers to the boundary of the metropolitan area, we're picking up growth. We refer to this evening out of densities here as metropolitan decentralization, or if you prefer, suburbanization. Just to repeat, metropolitan decentralization or suburbanization. The other trend is that, and this is very difficult to see unless you can look from that angle on it, and perhaps you want to tip your paper sideways, you see the growth rates are greatest beyond the metropolitan area. They probably reach a maximum visually deceptive, but about there, say 30 or 40 kilometres beyond the metropolitan area. In the case of London, the growth rates are a maximum of about 120 kilometres, but that's just a diagrammatic generalisation over many metropolitan areas. Now, having set it up, let me say very quickly a few words about the changes that are occurring. And the first trend that I want to mention is the tendency toward metropolitan area decentralization, this evening up of densities within the metropolitan area. This has been going on for many, many years. Suburbanization is nothing new. This area became part of the very area where we're sitting, became suburbanized in about 1750. Large parts of Mayfair and Soho were suburbanized a little bit later. There's nothing new in this at all. It became in the 19th century much more dramatic. It was caused by, among other things, on the household side, rising incomes, as well as improvements in transportation. Both factors, the latter being a facilitating factor, both factors allowing preferences, particularly preferences for space, but sometimes for other urban amenities, to be realized. There's also in the 20th century been the role of the state, and I'm trying to generalize beyond the UK. The role of the state, the fact that mortgage relief there's mortgage relief there is tax relief on mortgage payments, typically encourages the construction of newer housing, so that fiscal policy, if you will, encourages decentralization. But as far as public housing is concerned, or state housing, the tendency, particularly before World War II and after World War II, to build large peripheral estates also encourage the process of decentralization. While households are decentralizing, firms and employment opportunities are also decentralizing. What we saw was that as people moved out, so services moved out, particularly those services which were sensitive to population. The labour force was moving out, because if a household moves out, that labour moves out. So that in terms of markets and in terms of access to labour, a number of firms tended to follow. Don't want to give you the impression that decentralization implies movement. Much of it does. But what decentralization is, a differential growth rate being higher in the suburban or outer areas than in the inner areas. Now, one final word about decentralization, and I'm going to have to hurry through this, is that the process of deindustrialization itself encourages decentralization. As large-scale manufacturing industries in the inner city or inner areas decline and are replaced, if they are replaced at all, by newer industries, often service industries, with different locational requirements, requiring more space, more access, better access to a labour force which is increasingly moving out, that the process of deindustrialization encourages suburbanization. And of course there is, as I've been implying, an interaction between the decentralization of households and the decentralization of firms. Let me move on very, very quickly to deconcentration. Now, decentralization has been accompanied by, and in fact may be considered part of, this broader process of metropolitan deconcentration, or to put it more accurately, regional deconcentration. That is to say, the tendency for, over the region, densities or population to be somewhat more evenly distributed. For the metropolitan area, this part, to be less dominant in the overall regional structure. Again, and I think we risk paying insufficient attention to this, and this is where the great danger of looking at this boundary tightly around the metropolitan area comes in. We have to look broader, over a broader scale. If we look over a broader scale, in the household case we find long distance commuting from the non-metropolitan zone to the metropolitan zone. We find the practice of working from home, visiting the office or the plant, or dare I say it, the university, once or twice a week. The practice of teleworking, the practice of migration on retirement or even anticipation of retirement. All this means that the outer area, this non-metropolitan zone, is growing very rapidly. Land use controls in the case of the UK, green belts and new towns have definitely encouraged the process of regional deconcentration. And also, if we're looking at possibility of employment opportunities growing there, which brings me on to employment opportunities in the non-metropolitan zone. Why are these growing? Well, partly they're growing because of the movement of households, so the household movement and employment movement, or deconcentration of both, are related. So it's partly that. Also, more generally, it is the tendency for firms to seek out low-cost labour, low-cost, higher productivity labour, lower absenteeism, lower lateness, lower-cost land. I mean, these are very real issues. Technological change is favouring different capital output ratios or labour capital ratios, and this is having an effect on the kinds of areas which firms find attractive. Added to this, we have the fact that the metropolitan area, not just the inner city, but the whole metropolitan area is becoming unattractive as an industrial location by virtue of often high factor costs, high rates of local taxation, and also because of congestion, environmental pollution. Now, it's not simply two other factors are important here. It's partly the firms are able to internalize, and this is what Michael was mentioning a moment ago. Firms can internalize some of the externalities of the metropolitan area. In other words, the externalities are advantages to a firm, let's call them advantages, which are external to the firm. The firm has no control over them. But these externalities are available in a metropolitan area context, where we call them typically agglomeration economies. All I'm saying is nowadays, many firms, particularly larger firms, and even medium-sized firms, can internalize these externalities. That is to say, they can provide them on their own behalf. And as a result of that, they don't need to be at the metropolitan area, within the metropolitan area. But it's not just a question of firms turning their back on the metropolitan area simply because they've internalized the externalities. Oftentimes, firms are not able to do so, but as a result of improved communications, firms can can enjoy the advantages. And I think this, Michael came within an ace of saying this, and if he had, I would have been very annoyed, because this is one of the important points I wanted to emphasize, that firms can enjoy the advantages of a metropolitan area without being in a metropolitan area. And they can be hundreds of kilometers, or at least a couple of hundred kilometers away. And I think this fundamental change in the spatial relationships is important. Now, I had a whole section with some fascinating stuff on implications, but I've just received a very cryptic note from the chairman telling me to draw my comments to an end. But I cannot resist the temptation at least to say what some of these implications were. And I've a number of issues, three implications of all this analysis. The issues: drift of public transport, environmental concerns, growing inequality and segregation, the position of the metropolitan area economy itself, policy formulation, the interrelatedness of the various parts, and therefore the openness of the various parts of this metropolitan area-based region. And of course, the spatial externalities and spillover effects, the impact that an activity or an action in one part will have favorably and unfavorably on other parts. And finally, forms of government. Jan Caulfield was talking about the metropolitan form of government which existed or was set up in Brisbane in 1922. I suspect it's not metropolitan. In this country, we've abandoned, except for Edinburgh and Glasgow, we've abandoned metropolitan government, and that's about to be abandoned. So those were the implications, three sets of implications, and of course regional government. Maybe you can say a word about that in discussion, formal or otherwise. But let me finally, to everyone's great relief, I'm sure, draw this to an end by making just 2 or 3 closing points. The first is that a number of long-term forces are acting on the metropolitan area. These are not particularly new. They have been going on for at least 100 years, and have to be seen in that historical context. Income growth, technological change, transportation improvement. These forces are causing the form and the economy of the metropolitan area to change. But what I've been describing is not a market process. The government has not been passive in all this. The government has been most assuredly an actor, whether deliberately or unwittingly. And that's an important point to emphasize. The change I don't regard as inevitable. I never like the word inevitable, but I would regard these changes as normal or ordinary or commonplace. We are faced with an apparent paradox, or at least something of an irony. The metropolitan area is increasing its extent, its reach, by virtue of a number of linkages from the metropolitan zone to the non-metropolitan zone. Yet, at the same time, the relative position of the metropolitan zone relative to the whole metropolitan area-based region appears to be declining. Certainly it cannot be counted upon as a generator of employment and population. My argument, and I'll return to where the very beginning, is that we cannot understand, we cannot describe, let alone understand, let alone make reasonable or rational attempts at policy formulation without understanding the metropolitan area in this much wider context of the metropolitan area-based region. And were we to have a similar conference 100 years from now, I suspect that we might look back on the metropolitan area as opposed to the metropolitan area-based region. We might look on the metropolitan area as an economic artifact of the 19th and early or mid-20th century, and something which has really ceased to be a meaningful unit. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
John, thank you very much for that. I'm sure some of those points you had to skip through very quickly at the end become part of the discussion period in what I hope is 20 minutes' time. The next paper is by two authors, Paul Foley and Paul Lawless. I'm not too sure how you're... Right. And you're presenting the whole paper.
I'm responsible for the good bits. Paul Lawrence, who isn't here, needless to say, is responsible for the weaker parts you've heard. Is it possible to open that window again? It is getting rather stuffy in here.
Yes, it's noisy, that's the only problem.
I'll shout. Is that... Can we have the first slide, please? I will do my very best to talk for 20 minutes and only 20 minutes. You push it round. I will have to stand here. I'm going to change the scale of this analysis somewhat. I will talk just about... Can you push it a little further over, please? Thank you. A single city, a single area where some work has actually been done looking towards the future. The city is Sheffield. Sheffield, as you know, has a worldwide reputation for cutlery, smoke, doom and gloom. This is the P&O Ferry Guide. This is a map of England from the P&O Ferry Guide. Sheffield is England's 4th largest city. Newark is on there, Norwich is on there, Bristol is on there. Sheffield is ominous by its omission. Sheffield has an image problem. And at a time when lots of cities are going for image, Glasgow's miles better, London as a financial centre, Manchester as the Olympic Games centre, Sheffield feels left out. It has followed a particular route. It went for the World Student Games. It went for what was once described as Europe's largest indoor shopping mall. That has had considerable knock-on effects within the city, and most notably within the city centre. It's those issues that I will talk about and the response that I and a number of other academic colleagues, not just Paul Lawless, have been thinking about with regard to Sheffield's central area. The discussion is divided into 5 sections. First of all, a brief look at Sheffield, what it is, a consideration of the growth in popularity of partnership initiatives, which seems to be the way government is forcing most groups to go at the moment, a brief look at the impact of some of these major venues within Sheffield on the central area itself, and finally a consideration of the project that I've been involved in and the future policies, future orientation, future things that we need to be careful of within most cities. What is true for Sheffield is going to be true for most cities. There's also been an emphasis to talk about London within much of this conference, so perhaps it might be useful to have a look at another city. Whilst Sheffield doesn't exist in some people's mind, it is actually quite a pleasant place. It has green bits, it has city bits, it has a central area that has recently been improved a little with the arrival of a shopping centre within the city centre and the Lyceum Theatre that was upgraded with urban programme money. To all intents and purposes, it's quite a nice place. Much of the push for that revitalisation in different areas came about because Sheffield has undertaken a massive turnaround. It was one of the last 3 authorities in 1984 that wasn't going to set a budget. It was a very left-wing authority. It has changed now to being one of, Mrs. Thatcher actually used it once as an example, prime example of partnership within the United Kingdom. Partnership is supposed to be all pervasive. Often, in many of the ways government is now putting out money, partnership or showing partnership is the only way to get money from central government. The best example of that by far is City Challenge. Prize, £37.5 million. Show us that you're all friends, the private sector and the public sector. Now, in large authorities, the private element perhaps can be watered down. 37.5 million isn't a lot. In Batley, 37.5 million, and they were successful in City Challenge, is going to give the private sector and those partnership groups an awful lot of clout. Training and enterprise councils and other groups are all ways that partnership has been developed or slowly introduced. Sheffield has turned around. It decided that it would have to play this game if it was going to get anywhere. It needs resources for change to happen. There is an organisation called the Sheffield Economic Regeneration Committee, which is made up of about 30 members from local authorities, business, education, media, you name it, they're on it. And it is in part as a result of their concerns about Sheffield city centre, and just the city centre, I would mention, that the project that I'm about to talk to you about came about. There is massive concern that the economic decline, the arrival of Meadow Hall, and various other factors have led to the decline of the city centre. It's interesting in that many of the presentations that have been made have just looked at the central area of cities. The vast bulk of the population live in the suburbs. They are forgotten. The city centre is the thing that one takes away an image of a city with. Our project that has been undertaken is in association with the two universities there. It's no longer a polytechnic, it's actually now Sheffield Hallam University, which was to look at the city centre until the year 2010, to look at a wide variety of different factors: leisure, transport, education, retail, manufacturing, commerce, arts and entertainment. We've done that by utilising the skills for free. Peter Sperrit, we didn't get paid a penny for much of this, by having regular one-day brainstorming sessions with academics that had an interest or expertise in many of those particular areas. In many of those sessions, we've also invited along members from the private sector, property developers, property agents and other groups, to actually say, is the finger on the pulse? This is what the academic literature says is going to happen by the year 2010. Does this have some sense? Trying to look forward to what the future might hold in store for Sheffield, what the downside of those predictions were going to be, and how they could be tweaked or adjusted for the benefit of the city. The simple questions that must arise are, why on earth do you bother about the city centre? Many people within Sheffield, with a 1 million square foot shopping mall, now just shop there. That is now regarded as the city centre. I think we've all implicitly talked about a number of the benefits of the city centre in what we've been saying. It constitutes the heart of the city. In 1981, the city centre contained over 20% of jobs. It's where an awful lot of people work. It's the main centre not only for shopping, also for recreation, business, cultural and social activities. A lot of people go there on a regular basis. 80% of the population in poverty areas in Sheffield live adjacent to the central area. It is their local shopping centre. It is important to them. I think a lot of the suburbanisation that you talked about has a dramatic effect on them. Degradation of the central area means that those people in greatest poverty who use that as their local centre are considerably disadvantaged. And finally, the name of the game must be to improve your city centre, because as we've all done, we've probably all stayed in hotels in the centre of London, that is the perception of London we will take with us. Not the suburbs, not anywhere else, most places you go to. The city centre is the image of the city that you will take with you. Okay, so I'll briefly talk about two major developments. The Meadow Hall shopping mall, which is 116,000 square metres, offers 12,000 car parking spaces, opened in September 1990. Don't laugh, there are 28 planning applications for these currently on the stocks. Every city may have one soon. It is abhorrent to most people from the States that I've talked to that these things are still going up and we haven't learnt the lessons from America. It's located about 3 miles from Sheffield city centre, Spending in the last year was about £250 million. It employs approximately 5,000 people and attracts about 20 million visitors a year. Anything like that is going to have a substantial effect on a city centre, a city even. The other facilities that have been produced have been things for the World Student Games. Many of those equally haven't been located in the city centre. This is the Don Valley Athletics Stadium. Very pleasant. The idea being you can see Sheffield on the television regularly once a year when they held the McVitie Challenge. That is Sheffield Arena, 12,000 seating capacity. Pavarotti's been there, Eric Clapton, Dire Straits. It is one of the major northern venues now. There is actually some wider benefit to Sheffield from having it there. It is a venue that previously wasn't there, that will draw an awful lot of people into the city. Hopefully they will stay within the city and spend money there. The reality appears to be somewhat different. The illusion is there, the image is there. That is the only one of these facilities that has actually been located within about 2 miles of the central area of the city. It's Ponds Forge Swimming Pool, due to hold the European Swimming Championships in 1993. Image again. Sheffield as a centre, a sporting centre, a leisure centre, a recreational centre. That's had downside as well. That shop there says designer clearance shop. Much of the city centre, the retail elements have now started to trade down. Clearance shops are everywhere. Buy it quick, stack it high, sell it even quicker. And there are an increasing number of voids, even in the better parts of Sheffield city centre now. As part of our exercise, we wanted to talk to people about what they thought was currently wrong with Sheffield city centre and what should happen to it in the future. We undertook a shopper survey interviewing about 500 people, primarily about shopping habits, but also to try and get some feel of people's views about the central area. We asked them about those things as well. If you have one of these on your doorstep, this is what the impact may be. You don't have to take the figures that most of the Gateshead and Merry Hills and others give you, who only carry out surveys of shoppers within them. As far as I know, this is about the only survey that has actually been undertaken outside the remit, unfunded by a shopping mall. 90% of the Sheffield population have visited Meadow Hall. I must admit, I went once. On average, respondents visited Meadow Hall 13 times a year. They spend more there than they usually do in the city centre. Average spending now represents about 14% of their spending in the city centre. That equates to a loss in trade from Sheffield city centre of £40 million out of a total turnover of about 325 million. The effects have been dramatic. 12% of shoppers from other cities that had visited Meadow Hall actually went on to visit Sheffield city centre though. There's an element that one mustn't only see this as a threat, it might actually have a knock-on advantage as well, perhaps for arts and leisure amenities rather than the shopping or retail element that Meadow Hall is obviously offering. That was the shopper view. We also interviewed almost half of the retailers within the city. 49% said they were now in competition with Meadow Hall, no great surprise. 71% had suffered a fall in turnover. That average fall in turnover, that's raw figures, not accounting for inflation that was running at 5 or 6%, was about 13.5%. They have lost a great deal of trade. That loss has also not been shared evenly throughout the city. Comparison outlets, clothes and shoes, the things that really these shopping malls offer are the areas that have suffered the most within Sheffield city centre. And those, as you will realise, represent the heart of most shopping areas, often with a periphery of cheaper, lower rental retailers around them. It is the heart that is starting to be knocked out of Sheffield city centre. The periphery that really serves much of the more disadvantaged community that live nearby is surviving relatively well. Okay. Those then are the problems, but is it all a problem? At first sight, both developments appear to be very detrimental, but it has been argued very strongly, but there is little proof to actually suggest it, that the city's image is improving. We carried out a survey of London-based property agents who said, yes, Meadowhall has actually for the first time put Sheffield on the relocation map. Relocations from London reached their highest level since location of Office Bureau records started in 1964. They reached their highest level in 1991. There seems to be some flight from London. If image is a game, and certainly in many of the European marketing, urban marketing conferences that I've been to, they are well jumping on that bandwagon, trying to project some sort of image. They raise the city's profile, but as I've said, they suggest they actually have a detrimental effect on the city centre. And it is largely that the project that I have been involved in was set to tackle. And I will encapsulate some of these recommendations arising from our report. As I said, the idea was that it was a brainstorming session with about 20 academics and generally 10 to 15 private sector representatives. We divided the functions of the city into different sectors. So there were leisure and arts and tourism, transport. There was a group looking at poverty and other things. They actually projected forward their ideas. They were fascinating sessions. And what arose from that was that if Sheffield is to try and improve by the year 2010, there need to be a large number of changes. Trying to encapsulate a 200-page document on one sheet of A4, as that doesn't really do it justice. I'll try and pick out some of the things. There needs to be a quality central area. If Sheffield is to compete, A, with other cities, but perhaps more importantly with Meadowhall, it needs to offer some diversity of functions. It can't just compete in terms of retail. There have to be restaurants there. It has to be a pleasant environment, a much more pleasant environment than it is at the moment. It has to appeal to local people. It isn't really in competition with people from a long way around. The majority of people that work there are local. The majority of people that visit there are local. Very few people from other cities visit Sheffield. Very few Sheffield shoppers go elsewhere. One has to start incrementally with the local population and find their needs and their requirements. Partnership has to happen. There is no way, I think, under the present regime, with borrowing capacities being set back by local authorities, that development will take place in any other way. We're at the peak of a slump at the moment. Perhaps this is the best time for our sort of report. It offers some way forward, perhaps when development does start taking place. Debate has now started about the ideas that we've put forward for the future up until the year 2010. It's going on in the press. There might at least be some consensus. Public, private, local people versus those that are in power about what may happen. Investment in the future is also likely to be very constrained on small projects, almost entirely small projects. Property developers aren't going to get their fingers burnt again, putting too much money in too big a projects. That therefore leads to a need for local authorities or partnership groups to actually coordinate schemes, to have some idea where they are going so that these smaller schemes can all become part of one another and complement one another. There's a great need to consider transport. One of the things that I'm surprised hasn't come out of this conference, and we laboured long and hard about in our discussions, was the effect of global warming and the environmental movement. It was fascinating that over a 10, 15-year time period, there are likely to be introduced hydrocarbon taxes of some sort, depending upon the rate of global warming. That could have a tremendous knock-on effect on the price of electricity for electrical cars or the use of petrol for ordinary cars. Greater use of public transport might happen. It might actually lead to a retrenchment back to the city from the suburbs. There are heads nodding. There must be growth in leisure. That trend has started. It looks set to continue. Perhaps it will only be the top 50% of the population that have money that will fuel that growth, but it must be a growth sector within most cities. I will avoid the quarters. The single largest sector within most cities that is likely to grow is the educational sector. There is 33% growth in the number of students predicted entering UK higher educational institutes by the year 2000. Sheffield's two universities currently spend about £170 million a year. Students spend about £100 million a year. That is almost the same level of spending that is undertaken in the whole of Sheffield city centre, which is 325. Higher educational institutes over the next 10 years are going to have a significant impact. There is a greater need for housing within the city centre because housing has generally been driven out. There is a lack of vibrancy. There are feelings of perception, or the perceptions of safety are relatively poor. There is perhaps scope within the increase in the higher educational sector for more students not to be placed in ghettos but to be placed in mixed developments of some sort, to use those as pump priming facilities to improve housing. We also see a need for a city manager to come about. Too often in too many local authorities, particularly city authorities, and most cities do have now a single administration, unlike London, individual departments are segmented. Education departments, retail departments and so on, all have a wide single sector remit. Very few think about the impact of their policies on one area, such as the city centre. If the city centre is so important, there are a number of cities, Birmingham, Coventry, Reading, Bradford, that have recently appointed city managers to try and coordinate that function. If partnership is going to be one way forward, coordination of smaller projects, etc., etc., there needs to be greater thought given to the management of cities in the future. I will conclude, which will just about be spot on time. I'd like to think that our partnership project has adopted an innovative approach to deal with a number of major city centre problems, and certainly in terms of looking forward. It perhaps builds on Michael Edwards' idea of community-based involvement in planning for the King's Cross development. Our next stage is to offer our plan, whatever it is, looking at the future across a wider remit than unitary development plans or other plans actually do to the public. The two developments that I've talked about have been beneficial. They perhaps turned around the city's image, but perhaps not enough thought was given to the knock-on effects of them within the city. They're not unusual. As I mentioned before, there are 28 planning applications for shopping malls currently outstanding. Many of them are currently at appeal. Many of those appeals, if previous speakers are to be believed, will be overturned and they will go ahead. There are indirect spin-off benefits for the city centre, but no one has ever really quantified those yet. Perhaps Sheffield city centre only faces short-term problems in readjustment. I think many of the changes that are taking place are more deeply seated and offer much greater hope. But hopefully, with some readjustment, realignment and greater thought about the future, particularly at a time when things are at rock bottom, there might be some greater coordination in Sheffield city centre to guide some way forward that might be mutually beneficial, instead of the market intervening and putting a number of different things in different places with little thought for the overall cohesion of the centre. Thank you.
Paul, thank you very much. If we can now open the session for question time for, I guess, something like 15 minutes. That's questions for all three speakers.
I just got raise a question with John Parr, who described this process of decentralisation, deconcentration, suburbanisation. The term counter-urbanisation is sometimes used in this context. It's not a field in which I'm at all expert, but I noticed that a lot of your data relates to the period of the 1970s, in fact. My hunch is from the work of people like Tony Champion and so on, that there is a possibility that when we get full data for 91 from our own census and from other areas too, we'll begin to see a pattern in which counter-urbanisation, population decentralisation and so on might be described as a spent force. Really what you're describing is something that was at its peak during the 1970s and in recent years, and for a whole variety of reasons, may be beginning to lose some of its impetus.
Can I just add one thing to that? Michael Parkinson, who's done a lot of work for DOE and other groups, has got initial census results that suggest that the London population has increased since 1985 for the first time in 50 years. Those are his words, not mine. But
Okay, well, I can't respond to something I haven't seen in print, but your point. Decentralization has been going on for a long time. My argument is that it's coming to be replaced by, or it's operating over a larger scale and is subsumed within a broader process called deconcentration. I don't really care for the term de-urbanization, because that implies people are no longer